All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's shir. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Teves, Mrs. Selma Wall, for dedicating all of his Sherman drushos this month with immense gratitude for the refuah from HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the merit of a refuah shlema for all of those who need, the schus of our brave soldiers, and in the schus of the return of all of our hostages. Our week of learning sponsors, Chazan Mark Childs of Santa Barbara, California, in appreciation for the Daf Yomi shir and for the refuah shlema of Binyamin Yankel Ben Bela. And our day of learning, sponsored by Adina Hirsch, in honor of her nephews serving in the Israel Defense Forces, protecting Am Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael. May they be matzliach and Emirz Hashem return to their families b'shalom and b'karov. And of course, again, we dedicate all of the Seches Baba Kama Le'ilui Nishmas Master Sergeant Elio Karush. Elio Michal Karush Hashem Yikom Damo. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, his neshama will have an aliyah and his family ein nechama. Rabbi say with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today and not a lot of time to do it in. So today's daf is Nun 50. We are picking up in Eretz Hashem on Mem Tes Amud Beis 49b, and we left off Amar Rabbah. Amar Rabbah. So if you see Tosas Bershus Harabim in the right-hand column, so just move your finger across and move your finger leftward, and you'll pretty much get to it. Amar Rabbah. Mashkono shel Yisrael biyad ger umeis hager. So it's an interesting case. Let's say Ruvain lent Shimon money. Ruvain lent Shimon money, and again in this case over here, Shimon is a ger. Shimon is a convert. Shimon went ahead and gave collateral to Ruvain. So Ruvain now is in possession of collateral belonging to a convert. Shimon passed away. Shimon passed away, leaving no heirs. Leaving no heirs. So remember again, what's the halacha when it comes to property of a ger who passes away with no heirs? Hefker. Hefker. So what's the halacha? Ultimately, again, and now another Jew comes along. Let's say Levi comes along, and I'm sorry. This is the opposite case. Excuse me. This was again Mashkono Shayisrael biyad ger. Excuse me, just the opposite case. Again, we could just keep the same names, but Ruvain lent Shimon money, right? Ultimately, Ruvain is the ger. Ruvain is the ger. Shimon gave him collateral. And now ultimately again. And now, and now Ruvain, the lender, the ger, dies. Sorry about that. And now another Jew comes along and takes possession of that collateral. What's the halacha? Motziin oso miyado. Ultimately, we extract it from the second Yisrael. Why is that my time? Kevan de misle ger pakale shibude. Because once the ger dies, once the ger, who in this case is the lender, passes away, any shibud, any lien on the property automatically goes ahead and dissolves. Remember, we'll say we're talking about a ger who doesn't have inheritors, who doesn't have heirs. So if a ger who doesn't have heirs passes away, his property becomes hefker, which means if Ruvain the ger had lent money to Shimon, Shimon had given him collateral. Now Ruvain dies. There are no heirs. The debt dissolves. If the debt dissolves, the lien on the property dissolves, which means Shimon gets his collateral back. So if Levi thought, I'm going to chaparayim, because Ruvain passed away, he's a ger with no heirs, I'm going to seize the collateral, make it my own, that does not work. We would extract the property from Levi and ultimately, again, give it back to Shimon. Mashkoron shel ger biyad Yisrael. This is the case that I was explaining before. What about the reverse case? What about ultimately, again, Ruvain lent Shimon money. Shimon is a ger. Shimon gave Ruvain collateral. So now Ruvain is holding on to the mashkon of a ger. Umeis hager. And now the ger dies. So Shimon passed away. And what happened? Uba Yisrael achar v'hechzik bo. And now another Jew came along, Levi came along and took the mashkon from Yisrael. Right, from Ruvain, right? So now, again, let's just frame it once more. Ruvain lent money to Shimon. Shimon is a ger. Shimon went ahead and gave Ruvain collateral. So far, so good. Now what happens? Shimon dies, no heirs. Levi hears that a ger with no heirs passed away. What does Levi do? He comes to Ruvain, takes the collateral, says, Hefker. So what's the halacha? Zeh kana kenegin ba'osav, v'zeh kana es hashar. So the way it works is Ruvain holds on to the collateral in the amount ultimately that corresponds to the debt that he is owned by Shimon, Zichron Livracha, right? And now Levi gets to keep the value of the rest of the mashkon. The Gemara says, why? Va'amai, tikni lechatzero. I don't understand. We'll say, if Ruvain is in possession of this mashkon, the moment that Shimon the ger dies, where's the mashkon? The mashkon is in Ruvain's property. Let Ruvain's property acquire the mashkon for Ruvain the moment that Shimon the ger dies. The Rabbi Yosef Adam your chatzar, this goes back, right? We had this in our Gittin days, right? Your chatzar has the ability to go ahead and acquire on your behalf even without your knowledge. That's the power of a kinyan chatzar. So what's the case over here? The leisei. The case over here will say is at the time that Shimon the ger passed away, Ruvain wasn't present in his chatzar. Now, what is that? What does that have to do with anything? To which the Gemara says, "Kol hecha de'isili didei di boy makni matzi kakanyule." The Gemara says, "Chatzero." Kol hecha de'leisili didei di boy hula mikni lo matzi kani chatzero. Lo matzi kani chatzero nami lo kanyo. So we'll say, interestingly enough, the Gemara suggests that maybe your chatzar only works when you're present. While it's true that your chatzar could acquire on your behalf even without your knowledge, it does require your physical presence. But if you are not physically there, then your chatzar cannot acquire on your behalf. To which the Gemara says, "V'hilchasa deleise bechatzero lo kana." And I will say, ultimately, again, no, what's the case? The case actually, I will say, is the Gemara suggests your chatzar could acquire on your behalf even if you're not present. So technically speaking, when Shimon the ger dies, if the mashkon was in Ruvain's property, Ruvain's chatzar would acquire it on his behalf, even if Ruvain wasn't there. So what's the case that we're dealing with over here? The case we're dealing over here is that it's not that Ruvain wasn't in his chatzar, it's that the mashkon wasn't in the chatzar. So although Ruvain had this collateral, the collateral was not in Ruvain's property at the time that Shimon the ger died. Therefore, technically speaking, if someone else seizes that mashkon, technically speaking, they could be entitled to part of it. And that's why halacha l'maisa, Ruvain lent Shimon the ger money, right? Shimon gave Ruvain collateral. Shimon dies without heirs. If the mashkon was in Ruvain's property, then Ruvain acquires it. Ruvain acquires it. It's done if it was in his chatzar. But let's say the mashkon wasn't in Ruvain's property and Levi came along and seized the mashkon, then the halacha is Ruvain acquires the value of the mashkon corresponding to the value of his debt, and technically speaking, Levi would acquire the rest. Incredible. Let's go back to Mishnah. Hachofer bar b'shas hayachid v'upaschu l'shas harabim. Well, so now we're going to speak a little bit about bar, about the damage of a pit. So what happens? A person goes ahead and digs a pit in Rosh Hashanah, but the opening of the pit goes into or opens into Rosh Hashanah, or a person digs a pit in Rosh Hashanah, and the opening is into a Rosh Hashanah, or you dig a pit in one Rosh Hashanah, and ultimately again it opens into another Rosh Hashanah. In all of these cases, chayiv. In all of these cases, chayiv. Now, I will say, now Rashi gives an important caveat, and the caveat of Rashi is that whenever you're digging a pit in Rosh Hashanah, remember again, the only liability is when you're mafkir the makom, right? If I dig a pit in my property, I will say, my property, and someone comes in and falls into my pit, what's the halacha? What's the halacha? This corresponds back to yesterday's daf. So remember again, we paskin like Rebbe, that permission for entry does not correspond, does not also mean assumption of liability. That's how the Rambam paskins. So therefore, if I dig a pit in my property, I'm not liable if you fall in and something happens to it. That's on you. So the only time you are chayiv for bar in Rishus Hayachid is if you dig it and you mafkir it. That's it. So if you make it hefker. Now, if it's hefker, okay, anyone has the ability to come in and utilize that space. If someone gets injured, then einach hinami, there would be liability in such a scenario. Okay, so let's analyze. Tanabanan. Hachofer bar b'shus hayachid u'paschal b'shus harabim. Person digs a pit in Rishus Hayachid and the opening is Rishus Harabim. Chayiv. Ultimately, one is chayiv. V'zehu bara amar b'tar Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel says this is the paradigmatic bar. The paradigmatic bar is a bar that is dug in Rishus Hayachid and ultimately opens into into Rishus Harabim. That's Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Kiva says no. Hifkir Rishuso, v'lo hifkir boro. If you are mafkir your domain, but you weren't mafkir the area of the pit, zehu bar ha'amr batorah. Rabbi Kiva says that's the paradigmatic bar. Very interesting. So you're mafkir the area around the bar, but you're not mafkir the bar itself. That's paradigmatic bar. All right, let's analyze. When you have if you dig a bar in Rosh Hashanah, everyone agrees that you're chayiv. My time, because the pasuk says ki yiftach v'chi yichra. The pasuk talks about uncovering a bar and digging a bar. Now we'll say if you're going to be chayiv for opening a bar, then all the more so you're going to be chayiv for digging a bar. Ela shal iske psicha ba'al iske kriya ba'alo. Rather, what we were talking about over here is something very interesting. What we're talking about over here is a pit that only becomes yours because you dug it, or a pit that only becomes yours because you uncovered it. Meaning what? You can have a bar that you dig that's not really yours in a title sense. What's an example of that? A bar in Rosh Hashanah, right? You can't own property in Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah belongs to everyone. But yet, interestingly enough, so how do you acquire ownership over this bar? Through digging it or through uncovering it. So that's how you acquire, so to speak, liability for title purposes, but not actually for ownership purposes. To which the Gemara says, Lo nechluku ella, the machlokes is only top of Nun, 50a, Lo nechluku ella bebar bershuso. So we'll say ultimately again, the machlokes is only when it comes to a bar that you dig in your own property. What does this mean? Rabbi Akiva says, bar bershuso nami chayiv. So Rabbi Akiva holds that even if you dig a bar in your own property, you're going to be chayiv. So the Gemara says, Dichsev bal habar. Pasuk says, talks about the balabar. But bar, the islay bailim. We're talking about a bar that has an owner. They both say, what's the case of a bar that has an owner? That's a bar that you dig in your own property, because you had the right to dig it. At a certain point, you had ownership over it. Rabbi Shmuel Silber, bal hatakala. Rabbi Shmuel says, no. When it says balabar, it means the owner of the person who created the stumbling block. Who is the person who created the stumbling block? That's the guy who dug the bar or uncovered the bar, even if the bar is in Rosh Hashanah. So I will say, interestingly enough, what you see them really arguing about is the nature of liability. The nature of liability of a bar dug in one's own domain. So the Gemara says, "Ela mai zewa bar amar b'Torah." So Amar Rabbi Akiva. So what does it mean? Rabbi Akiva says that this is the bar that the Torah speaks about. So the Gemara says, "Zeu bar shepasach ba'akasav tchila l'tashlumin." It means that this is the paradigmatic case. So the Torah speaks about the concept of liability for repayment purposes. Rabbi Yosef says, "Bebar b'shos hayachid kol ya'amlo plegidim mechayiv." So Rabbi Yosef has an alternate understanding. So we'll say in his first understanding, everyone is agreeing that a bar b'shus harabim, of course you're going to be chayiv. What's the point of contention? A bar b'shus hayachid. Okay, Rav Yosef says just the opposite. Everyone agrees that in a bar b'shus hayachid, everyone agrees that you're chayiv. My taima, bal habar amarachmana, bebar de islay baila maskinan. Because the way the Torah frames bar liabilities, it speaks about bal habar. Now I will say, how do you become bal habar? Only if you own it. How do you own it? Only if it's dug in your own property. So keep pligi, where's the machlokas? Bebar b'shus harabim. The machlokes ultimately is what happens if you dig a bar in Rosh Hashanah. Rabbi Shmuel Silber bar b'shus harabim nami chayiv. Rabbi Shmuel holds that even if you dig a bar in Rosh Hashanah, you're also going to be chayiv. Why? Dichsev ki yiftach v'chi yichra. Because the pasuk says if you uncover or if you dig. Now, if you think about it, this is redundant, right? This is redundant. Why? Why does the Torah have to speak about that? There's liability if you uncover a bar, or there's liability if you dig a bar. Why do you need both of those? Obviously, I will say, if there's liability for uncovering a bar, where I didn't even make it, I just uncovered it, then Allah has kama v'kama what? There's liability for digging a pit. So why do you need both of those? The Gemara says, Ella sha'al iske psicha val iske kriya ba'alo. So I will say, this is really fascinating. And this, by the way, this is how we paskin. So Rabbi Shmuel says, because the Torah is coming to teach me the following. The Torah is coming to teach me that even if it's just a pit that you dig, or just a pit that you uncover, but even if it's not a pit that you own, Now, where do you have a case of a pit that you dig or that you uncover, but you don't own it? What's that case? Rishus Harabim. That's the case of Rishus Harabim. Shabbos says, I just want to point out, this is beautiful. This Rabbi Shmuel is beautiful. So look what you have according to Rabbi Shmuel. According to Rabbi Shmuel, the phrase Bal Habar, the owner of the bar, teaches me that there's a case of ownership over a bar in which there's liability. What's the case of bar ownership where there's liability? That's where you dig a bar in your own property in Rishus HaYachid. You're subsequently mafkir it. You have to make it hefker, right? But that's case one. Case two is where the Torah says that ultimately, again, ki yiftach v'chi yichra. If you open a bar or you dig a bar, what's that case? Where liability is assigned to you if you open it and you dig it, even if you don't own it. What's that case? That's Rishus Harabim. It's beautiful. What a drasha. What a drasha. Therefore, in Bishmal's model, there's liability ultimately, again, for bar, whether you own it, i.e. you dug it in your own property, or whether you just opened it or dug it, even if you don't own it in a titular sense, you don't have title to it. Was that case? That's ultimately, again, Rishus Harabim. Incredible. Rabbi Akiva, Hano Matzrich Tzrichin. Rabbi Akiva will say the Torah needs to talk about digging and needs to talk about uncovering. Why? Listen to this. If the Torah would have just talked about uncovering a bar, Hava Amina Poseach Hu Desagile. So I would have thought like this. If you open a bar, remember I will say, here's the good news. If you open a bar, you could remedy that. How do you remedy it? Close it. Koralo sagi b'kisui at the time. Like what's about is an incredible Musar Haskell will talk about with that. That sometimes when you make a mistake in life, the good news is Baruch Hashem, you can fix it. You opened the bar, you uncovered the bar, no problem. You could fix it. But I would have thought in the case where you dig a bar, maybe covering it is not enough. What do you have to do? So the Gemara says, I might have thought that I will say if you dig the bar, covering it is not enough. Rather, what do you have to do in order to remedy the situation? Fill it back in. Kamash Malon, no. That even if you dig a bar, you could remedy the situation by simply covering it. If Torah would have just said ki yichra, which is ultimately again about digging the bar, havamina kriyahu debai kisui mishum da'avid ma'isa. I might have thought that in the case of where you go ahead and you dig a bar, that's where you have to cover it, because since you did a ma'isa of digging it, you need a ma'isa of covering it. Aval poseach delo avid ma'isa, but opening a bar where you didn't really do a ma'isa. In other words, the bar was dug without you. So the Gemara says, ema kisui nami lo bai. Maybe it doesn't even need a covering. Kamash malon, no, that if you open it, you have to cover it. If you dig it, you have to cover it. Ella mai zeha bara amar batar the Rabbi Shmuel. So what does Rabbi Shmuel mean when he says this is the bar that is mentioned in the Torah? Zehu bar shepasaba kasav tchilin izikin. This ultimately again is the bar that the Torah begins with to assign damage liability to you. Good. So we'll say, let's pause here for just a moment. We are in the third wide line of 50a. So we'll say, so again, I want you to remain hyper focused on this position of Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel is telling me that the pasuk by bar is teaching me liability for two different boros. Bal habar, by calling me the digger, right? By calling me the person who dug the bar, the Bal habar, right? I am the bar. So what's that case? That's a case of where I go ahead and dig the bar in Rishus HaYachid. Since I'm digging it on my property, ultimately, again, I'm the balabar. Obviously, there's only liability if I subsequently make it hefker, because then it becomes accessible to everyone. Then the Torah also says, ki yiftach or ki yichra. Why do you need both of those things? Because Rabbi say that talks about where I become the liability owner, even though I'm not the titular owner. What's the liability owner, even without title? What's that case? That's bar b'rishus harabim. Rabbi Shmuel has a drasha to teach that there's liability for both of these bars. Beautiful. Meisvei, the Gemara is a kasha. Meisvei. Hachofer bar b'rishus harabim upas upis chol rishus hayachid pater. If a person digs a bar rishus harabim and ultimately again it opens up to rishus hayachid, you're going to be pater. Even though you're not allowed to do this, right? Lefi shein osin chalal tachas rishus harabim. Because Rose in general, it's actually interesting halacha. You are not allowed to hollow out the area underneath rishus harabim, because obviously if you do that, what do? You pose a risk to the integrity of the rishus harabim. Hachofer boros sichin umar aros b'rishus hayachid. If a person goes ahead and digs, literally again pits, water cisterns or caves in Rosh Hashanah, and the opening of Rosh Hashanah, chayiv. Ultimately, again, there's going to be bar liability. But if you dig pits, ultimately in Rosh Hashanah, next to Rosh Hashanah, kagon elu hachofrim la'avshin, or Lu'ushin, Pater. Also, for example, those who dig, it's actually interesting, those who dig pits to build foundations. I want to build a house. I'm building a house in my property that abuts the Rosh Hashanah. So I'm digging down, I'm digging a bar for the purpose of making foundations. Ultimately, again, Pater, there's no liability for that. I have the right to do that. To which the Gemara says, Rabbi Yosef Yehuda Mechayiv, Ad sheyasa mechitza asara, or Ad sheyarchik mimakom drisas raglei adam. So mimakom drisas raglei behema, arba'a tfachim. Rabbi say this is fascinating. Rabbi Yosef Yehuda says, no. Even though you're digging in Rishus HaYochid, it's in your property, you cannot dig right next to Rosh Hashanah. They both say, by the way, we have this today also. It's fascinating. What we call it? Setbacks. It's fascinating, right? You have to, right? You can't, even though it's your property, you cannot go ahead and dig right next to Rosh Hashanah. Rather, Rabbi Yossi says, either you have to make a mechitza, you have to make a wall that's 10 tfachim, or you have to go ahead and distance yourself 4 tfachim, which halavai, our setback should only be 4 tfachim, right? And make life a lot easier, right? So you have to set back 4 tfachim from the Rosh Hashanah. Now the Gemara says, Taima delusion. Now the reason, because all of this is because you're digging for foundations. Halav leushin chayiv. Now I will say, it seems to be the only reason why you're allowed to do this to begin with is because it's a purposeful digging, i.e. for foundations. But if it wasn't for foundations, it sounds like even digging in your own property would go in and create liability. Money? Whose opinion is this? So Bishlam the Rabbi Reish Rabbi Shmuel Silber Rabbi Akiva. So according to Rabbi's interpretation, the Reish will be Rabbi Shmuel Silber Rabbi Akiva. El Rav Yosef, but according to Rav Yosef, Bishlam a Sefer Divrei Hakol. Fine, the Sefer reflects the view of everyone. El Reish money, but whose opinion is reflected in the beginning of the Brisa? Lo Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Akiva. It's not Rabbi Shmuel nor is Rabbi Akiva. Rav Yosef also, you're right. Kula divrei hakolhi. In reality, the entire Bryce reflects both opinions. The Reisha shelo hifkir rishuso v'lo boro. The Reisha is talking about a case where the person was not mafkir, he did not make his rishus or his bar hefker. Well, if he didn't make it hefker, then what? There's no liability because it's personal property. Rav Ashi, now that you establish Rav Yosef's interpretation, that works according to everyone. Why does Rabbah have to set this up as a machlokes tanoim? After all, midrash Rabbi Shmuel, since the Reish is ultimately again Rabbi Shmuel, sefer nam Rabbi Shmuel. The taima delusion. The reason ultimately again why it's permitted is because you're digging for foundational purposes. Halav lu'ushin chayiv. But if you were not digging for foundational purposes, ultimately there would be liability. Which the Gemara says, Kigon the arvach arvuchi the Rosh Hashanah. No, the case in question could be you're digging for foundations, but what? You've extended the scope of the digging. You widened it more than it needed to be dug. So in other words, even if you want to say that lamaisa again, there is this permission to dig for foundational purposes. Halacha lamaisa, there is a cap. You can dig for what you need, but the moment you expand is ultimately the moment that there'll be liability. So the Gemara says, Meisvei reza kasha hachofer bar b'shos hayochid. Ultimately, again, is that the warning? Is that the warning? 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Okay, got it. Meisvei, all right. Okay, well, I'm going to have another minute. Meisvei, we're on a roll. Meisvei, hachofer bar b'shos hayochid upaskol Rosh Hashanah chayiv. So what did we learn before? That if a person digs a pit in Rosh Hashanah and ultimately opens it into Rosh Hashanah, you'll be chayiv. Rosh Hashanah Pater. If you dig it in Rosh Hashanah, but it's totally in Rosh Hashanah, next to Rosh Hashanah, ultimately you'll be Pater. So Bishlam the Rabbi. So according to Rabbi Kul Rabbi Shmuel, El Rabbi Yosef, but according to Rabbi Yosef, Bishlam Reish Rabbi Shmuel, El Sefer money. But say whose opinion does the Sefer reflect? Lo Rabbi Shmuel, v'lo Rabbi Akiva. It's ultimately again not Rabbi Shmuel and it's not Rabbi Akiva. He'll say once again, it's talking about a case where you're digging for a foundation and therefore it works according to everyone. So I will say, so bottom line, the takeaway that I want you to take from this sugya is this position of Rabbi Shmuel. Ultimately, again, Rabbi Shmuel is going to teach us that halacha l'maisa, there's going to be liability for both, right? There's really going to be liability, it's Rabbi Akiva also, but there's going to be liability for both bar b'shus hayachid and bar b'shus harabim. Bar b'shus hayachid ultimately is learned out from the phrase bal habar, and bar b'shus harabim is ultimately learned out from the fact that the Torah says ki yichre or ki yiftach. Talks about both opening and uncovering, talking about ownership that is only assigned because you've created liability. Where is there a case of ownership that is created because of liability, even though you don't possess title? That's a bar that you dig in Rishus Harabim. Incredible. Okay, let's go weiter. Says the Judas. No, escaped. So listen to this case. This is fascinating. I dug a pit, right? Or I opened the pit, and I gave it over to the rabbin. I gave it over to the public. So we'll say here, this is interesting. So what am I doing? I am providing a public service. So I'm going ahead and opening the pit. I dig the pit. I give it over to rabbin. Here, this is for you. Now, why would you dig a pit for the rabbin? If you could imagine, like I'm digging like a water cistern, and I'm digging a well. So what's the halacha? Nebo say, now what happens if someone falls into it and gets injured? What's the halacha? Pater. Ultimately, again, I am pater. Now, why am I pater? Because I gave it over to the rabbin. Chafar. Upasak v'lo masal rabbin. What happens if I opened up a pit and I didn't give it over to the rabbin? Chayiv. Ultimately, again, there's going to be liability. Rabbi said this incredible Gemara. Rabbi said this was the custom of this man by the name of Nechunya. He was known as Nechunya, the digger of boros, sichin, umaoros. Right, that umaoros. He was the digger of pits, water cisterns, and caves. That's how he was known. Now, how did he earn that title? Sheyachofer uposeach umosel rabbim. Rabbi said what this guy Nechunya would do is halacha l'maisa. He would dig water cisterns, and he would for public use. He would dig them and ultimately give them over to other people. It's so beautiful. So the Gemara says, Rashi points out over here in the first Y line of Rashi, why would he do this specifically? Chofer sichin la'olei regalim b'drachim. Rabbi said Nechunya would purposely dig on the roads that were used for the Olei Regel, right? The people would come to Yerushalayim. So remember again, coming to Yerushalayim, you'd be coming with your family. There's only so much, you could carry with you. So he dug wells dafka on the roadways leading up to Yerushalayim so that the pilgrims should go ahead and have access to water. It's so beautiful. So the Gemara says, Ukishashamu chachamim b'davar amru kayim zeh halacha zu. When the Chacham heard that Nechunya did this, they said, he was Makayim this halacha. Which halacha are they referring to? That if you dig a pit and you give it over to the rabbin, you don't have liability. So the Gemara says, halacha zu v'sulo. Is that to say that Nechunya observed this halacha, no other halacha? Ela ima af halacha zu. Rather, it means that Nechunya observed even this halacha. So I will say, so now the Gemara is going to tell an incredible story about this man Nechunya, an incredible Gemara. Tan Rabbanon, Ma'aseh bebito shel Nechunya chofer sichin, shenafla lebar gadol. It happened one time that the daughter of this guy Nechunya. So both say this girl. Both say, by the way, if Nechunya sounds familiar, remember again, we had him in Shkalim. We actually told this story in Shkalim as well. And we spoke about Nechunya was one of these people. There was a list of people who dedicated themselves to the needs of the community. So this guy Nechunya, literally again, his thing was going ahead and digging water sources. So we'll say, I just want to tell you, there's an incredible Musar Haskell on this. Even before we get to the story, the Musar Haskell will say is that sometimes people think that, like, in order to be of service to Klal Yisrael, you have to be a Rav or a Talmid Chacham or someone. It's not true. Everyone has a skill set. And if you could take your skill set and figure out, how could I use my skill set to benefit Klal Yisrael, then you have the ability to make a difference. So we'll say, what was Nechunya? He dug holes. You would think to yourself, okay, like he's a manual laborer. What is this guy going to do for Klal Yisrael? What did he do for Klal Yisrael? He thought, people need water when they go to the Beis HaMikdash. So he made it his business to dig wells wherever he could for the Olei Regalim. And I will say, this guy Nechunya, not Rav Nechunya, not Rabbi Nechunya, Nechunya. Nechunya, the ditch digger. Nechunya, the well digger, is in Shas. If Nechunya can make it into Shas, because he just decided to use his skill set for Klal Yisrael, we will say then we could do exactly the same thing. Okay, I'm not going to make it into Shas, right? That's closed, right? But Lamaisa, it just shows you that whatever your skill set, figure out how to use it for your people, and ultimately make a contribution. Incredible. So Gemara tells a story that Nechunya's daughter one time fell into a well. And what happened? Bava Dias Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa. He told Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa what had happened. So what happened? Sha'ari Shona, in the first hour that she was missing, Amr Lahem Shalom. He said to his students, so everybody was obviously distressed about this. She's missing in the well. They're trying to recover her. So Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa, first hour, she's fine. Shnia Amr Lahem Shalom. Second hour, he said, she's fine. Shlishis Amr Lahem Alsa. In the third hour, he said, she was saved from the well. Amrullah, so I will say, sure enough, she was saved from the well. So they asked her, Miha Allaho, how did you get out of the well? But listen to this. Amrulahem, Zachar Sharachilim Nizdameli, Vizakin Echad Manhigo. She said, an old man with a ram passed by the well, and he saved me. And I both say, who's the old man with the ram? Rashi says over here, Zachar Sharachilim, Elo Shal Yitzchak, Vizakin Manhigo Avraham. So essentially, she didn't know it was Avram Avinu, but ultimately, again, she just sees an old man with a ram, and again, it was understood that it was Avram Avinu who saved her from the well. Okay, we're going to come back to that in just a second. So Amrulo Naviata. So the students came back to Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa. Rabbi, how did you know that she was saved from the well? How did you know she was saved from the well? Are you a Navi? So Amr Lahem, Lo Navi Anochi v'lo ben Navi Anochi. Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa says, I'm not a prophet and I'm not the son of a prophet. Elakach amarti, but this is what I said to myself. Davar sha'osa tzadik mitztayer bo, yikashal bo zaro. I don't understand. Nechunya has spent his life digging wells for Klal Yisrael. Could it be that the very thing through which he contributed to Klal Yisrael is going to be the source of his misfortune, the loss of his daughter? Impossible. Impossible. It can't be that the very thing for which he dedicated his life for the Klal is going to be the source of such incredible loss. So therefore, again, Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa said, I knew that his daughter was going to be saved. Amr Ravacha said, Afal Pikein Meis Benobet Sama. You know, just tragically, even though this is so, Nechunya's son died of thirst. He died of thirst. Now, the circumstances around his death, the Gemara doesn't tell us, but Lamaisa, again, his son did die of lack of water. So the Gemara says, Shenemar Usavila. So before we get to this, just quickly, so what is going on with this story? What is going on with this story, right? So first of all, this idea that she's saved by Avram Avinu. So we'll say, Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa is saying something amazing. If a person ultimately, again, pushes himself for the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Ribono Shel Olam is not going to let a person be disadvantaged, ultimately, again, because of their service. So Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa says, Nechunya dug pits. It can't be that his daughter is going to lose her life falling into a well. It can't be. Now we'll say, now who saves her? Avram Avinu. So we'll say there's a concept by Avram Avinu, you know, in Parashas Vayera, very, 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 very quickly. Parashas Vayera, the Torah opens up where Chodesh Baruch Hu, Vayera Lev Hashem, Chodesh Baruch Hu is talking to Avram Avinu. And then what happens? Avram Avinu sees the three guests, right? He thinks they're men, they're malachim. And what does he do? He leaves the Shechina and runs to the three men. So we'll say the Gemara says a very important principle. What's the important principle? Gadol hachnasas archim yosra me'akbalas penei hashchina. You see from here that hospitality, greeting guests, is even more important than talking to Hashem. Because again, Avram Avinu left HaKadosh Baruch Hu and went to greet the guests. Ask the Heilige Baal Shem Tov, what does that mean? What does that mean? Does that literally mean, right, God's here talking to me, there are three strangers over here, that I should stop talking to God and go to strangers? The Baal Shem says like this. He'll say something amazing. He'll say there's a danger in Hachnasas Archim. What's the danger in Hachnasas Archim? What's the danger? What's the danger? I think everyone's had this moment in Hachnasas Archim where you have guests at your table and they start talking about something and you're like, oh no, right? You're not actually going to bring that up at my table, right? Like, we're not actually going to talk about this. My kids are here, I'm here, it's Shabbos. Like, no, we can't do that. And I will say, sometimes it's Lashon Hara, and sometimes it's just something inappropriate, and sometimes it's just like the kind of stuff where, like, I don't know, we just don't talk about that kind of stuff. We just don't do that. So I will say, so sometimes a person thinks, you know what? To preserve the Kedusha of my home, I'm circling the wagons and I'm not reaching out to other Jews. I'm not having other people at my table. So what does the Gemara say? Kadosh Baruch Hu says, it's okay. I'm okay with your own personal piety taking a hit in order for you to be inclusive of Klal Yisrael. That's what it means when it says, Gadol hachnasas archim yosem yachbal shechina. Now let's say everyone could have a holier Shabbos table if it's just you, your family, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You're right, that's of course going to be more halig. You could choose the topics, you could choose the zmiras, right? You could choose everything. But that's not what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants of us. HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants of us to be Klal Yisrael Jews. He wants us to have other people at our table. He wants us to open up our homes. But the spirituality, the holiness is going to take a hit. It's okay. It's okay. Sometimes it's okay for you to go ahead and diminish your own personal holiness for the sake of the benefit of being a Klal Yisrael Jew. That's what Avram Avinu taught for us. So therefore, I will say, what Avram Avinu essentially tells us is, whenever you do something for the sake of the klal, you are never going to be put at a disadvantage. That's the idea. You're never going to be put at a So therefore, again, Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa says, Avram Avinu teaches us that concept. That's the idea. Avram Avinu gives up a dialogue with the Shekhinah, in order to do something for other people. So therefore, Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa says that becomes a paradigm. Whenever you put yourself out for someone else, the Ribbon Shalom will never allow you to be disadvantaged. So Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa said, Nechunya has been digging wells for Klal Yisrael. The Ribono Shel Olam is not going to allow him to be disadvantaged. That's not the way the world works. And therefore, again, Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa says, I'm not a Navi, I'm not a Ben Navi, but I also know that his daughter is not going to lose her life in a well. Incredible, Rabbi say. Sometimes we think that what we give to the other leaves us with less materially, less emotionally, less spiritually. Just know, whenever you give to your people, whenever you give to the other, even if it looks like you're suffering a momentary setback, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will never allow you to be at a disadvantage when you give and when you do for Klal Yisrael. Such an incredible Gemara, if only we had more time. So Gemara says, in any event, but despite all of this, his son passed away. His son passed away from thirst. So the Gemara, although it doesn't tell us the circumstances of this, the Gemara says, Shene'emar u'sevivav nisara ma'od. So the Gemara quotes the pasuk from Tehillim, that literally, again, around them, there are great storms. We'll say sometimes, again, tzaddikim are dealt with greater stringency. Literally, those who surround HaKadosh Baruch Hu don't really have much latitude, but again, their judgment is like a hair's breadth. So the Gemara perhaps says that maybe the reason why Nechunya was judged so severely, or his son was judged so severely, was because of their piety. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Nechunya Amar Mehacha, El Na'arat Besod Kidoshin, Rabba V'nora Kol Savivav, Amar Rabbi Chanina, Kol Omer HaKadosh Baruch Hu V'atran. So we'll say, so again, so it's interesting, by the way, it's changed over here from Rabbi Nechunya to Rabbi Chanina, which is interesting. In other words, was it Rabbi Nechunya? Was it Nechunya Chofers? Good. Anyway, Rabbi Chanina says from this pasuk, Hel Na'aratz Besod Kidoshim. The Ribbon Shalom again is feared within the secret of his holy ones. Rabba V'nora Akol Savivav. Ultimately, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is great and Nora overwhelming on those who are closest to him. So we have this concept that tzaddikim are held to a different standard than everyone else. The Gemara says, whoever says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu just simply forgives. Vatron is mevater. He overlooks everyone. Yivatshu chayav. Ultimately, again, will give up his life. Shne'emar hatzur tamim pa'alo ki kol durachav mishpat. Ultimately, HaKadosh Baruch Hu always acts with judgment. Now, although there is divine compassion, but the Ribono Shel Olam is not mevater. HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't overlook things. HaKadosh Baruch Hu ultimately operates even with Midas Hadin. All right, we'll say so much to do in this Gemara, but we'll have to save it for a different time. Rabbi Chanina, Rabbi Chana, Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani. What's the meaning of the pasuk? I'm on base. Erech apayim, v'lo ksiv erech af. So I will say it's interesting. The Torah phrases this as erech hapayim. Erech hapayim means literally, again, prolonged anger or slow to anger, but it doesn't say erech af, it's apayim plural. What's the pshat? So the Gemara says, erech hapayim le'tzadikim v'la'reshoim. L'sh Baruch Hu is slow to anger both for the tzadikim and the reshoim. What does it mean? So Rashi says over here, for tzaddikim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is slow to give them their reward, doesn't give them their reward in this world, but rather gives them their reward in the world to come. And for the Rishaim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is also slow. What is he slow? He's slow to punish them. He doesn't punish them in this world, rather he punishes them in the world to come. Incredible. So turn around, both say, listen to this, these incredible Gemaras. Lo yisakel adam mereshuzal reshus harabim. Both say, ultimately, again, a person, both listen to this. Don't clear out the debris from your domain into Rishus Harabim. Right? Don't throw your garbage into Rishus Harabim. I will say, why? Listen to this. There was once a guy who was clearing out the debris from his domain into the public domain. Umatzu chassid echad. And the chassid found him. Amar lo reika. So the chassid says to this guy, you're a fool. Why are you clearing out debris from a domain that's not yours into a domain that is yours? We'll say, what does that mean? Your own personal property, maybe you'll hold on to it, maybe you won't hold on to it. Right? There are no guarantees in life when it comes to one's wealth. Rishus Harabim always belongs to everyone. So the chassid says to the guy, you're taking your debris from your property that is not really yours, because you may not own it tomorrow, and you're putting it in Rishus Harabim, which is definitively yours. You'll always have a chilik in that. So lig legalav. So the guy, we'll call him just the guy, thought the chassid was a fool. What are you talking about? This is my domain, this is my property, I'm clearing it out. So a little while later, what happens? So the guy fell on difficult times. He had to go ahead and sell his field. And he was walking on Rosh Hashanah, and I will say he tripped over what? He tripped over the stones that he had cleared out from his own field. Amar Yafar Amar Li Osa Chassid. Ultimately, you know what? The Chassid was right. The Chassidim are always right. The Chassid was right. Mipnei ma'ata mesakel mershus she'en lo shelcha l'rishus shelcha. When the Chassid told me, why are you going ahead and clearing out the debris from a field that's not yours into a field that is yours? Rabbi say, you ask yourself, okay, interesting Gemara, what's the Musar Haskell? Rabbi saying, a lot of times in life we have life debris. A lot of times in life we have things that are broken. There are things about, so what do I do with my broken things? What do I do with my debris? I'm great. You know what I say? It's kind of like your desk, right? What do you do with your desk? What do I do with your desk? I do this all the time. I have a meeting in my office. It's great. Piles. Piles are like the best things, right? Because what happens, you could just move stuff to a different area and suddenly it looks like, oh, look, everything is done. Everything is accomplished. We do the same thing with life debris. There are things that are broken inside of me. There are things that are broken in my marriage. There are things that are broken with my kids. There are things that are broken in my relationship. So what do I do? I just move them different places. Right? I take the stones from here and I move it over here. I take the debris over here, I take the debris, and I figure it's great, it's fantastic, because now what? Now the debris is not in front of me. And you know what the great news is? When the stones, when the rocks, when the debris are not in front of you, you know what the great part is? For those 3 minutes, you convince yourself that what? Doesn't exist. It's not existing until you trip over it 5 minutes later. The way to deal with debris is clear it out once and for all. If there are problems, if there are things that are broken, if there are things that are not working, then at the end of the day, find the courage not just to shuffle them around so you don't have to deal with it, but instead find the courage to deal with it definitively and decisively once and for all. Otherwise, wherever you move your stuff, you will find yourself tumbling and you'll find yourself falling all over them. Incredible. I will say, Mishnah. All right, we're making good time here. Mishnah. Person digs a bar and ultimately falls into it. So what's the halacha? Shar or chamar? Sorry, I said that the wrong way. Person digs a pit in Rosh Hashanah and a shor or a chamar falls into it. Chayiv, ultimately, again, one is chayiv. There's liability for that. Okay? I will say this actually, we'll talk about this in the Gemara. These are all different types of pits in all different types of shapes and sizes. So whatever you're digging, there's going to be liability. Imkain, lama ne'amar bar. If that's the case, why does the Torah say the word bar when it comes to liability? Ma bar sheyish bo kidei lahamis asar tfachim, af kol sheyish bo kidei lahamis asar tfachim. We're going to see that you're only chayav for a bar if the bar has the dimensions capable of killing. of killing. And what's the dimensions? 10 tefachim deep. 10 tefachim deep. If the pit was less than 10 tefachim deep and a sharach hamar fell into it, umes, and it died nevertheless, pater. Shabbos said, this is interesting. So now what we're talking about over here is, in order for there to be bar liability, the bar has to be capable of doing damage. What's the type of bar that's capable of doing damage? Ultimately, again, only a bar with a depth of 10 tefachim. If an animal falls into a bar that is smaller than that, what Allah again, damage still occurs. Ultimately, again, there is not a mace putter. Vim huzak, but if the animal is damaged, the animal doesn't die, even in a bar. Because remember again, it's only a bar of 10 tefachim more that has the ability to kill. A bar less than 10 tefachim doesn't have the ability to kill, and therefore, if it does kill, you're not chayiv. But it does have the ability to do damage, and therefore, there'll still be liability. We'll have to stop over here. I'm going to record the rest of the daf in Meretz Hashem. It's a long day today. It's plenty of time, right? So I'll record the rest in Meretz Hashem, put it out before Shabbos. Say shkoyach. All right, Chevron Zoom, good Shabbos, everyone. Good Shabbos, good Shabbos.